Welcome back to your Skill Builder. So, I want to congratulate you once again for always investing in yourself. Today, we're going to have a great conversation about one of the tools that we use in generating change in the original scope of a construction project. It's called a Field Work Directive, and it's exactly what it sounds like. And so we're going to go ahead and dive deep into the comprehension and understanding of how to use a field work directive. A field work directive is going to be instruction that is issued to make a change or complete work on site, typically in the field. So this can be an informal action followed by a formal document. This is very important, is that recognize that the work of a field work directive is to be able to initiate an immediate response to what's going on out in the field, but it must always be followed by formal documentation. This action can be initiated prior to determining if the work that's being directed is part of the original contract scope, if it's additional scope, or if it can be measured as an unforeseen condition before all costs and time are finalized. The difference from a change order, unlike a change order which involves fully defined scope, cost, and time, a field work directive is going to authorize immediate action while the details are being confirmed. So here's a look at what it might look like out on the job site. Of course, if I was just walking out on a job site, this is probably going to be in my handwriting on a set of drawings. But it's as simple as being able to provide a direction with a not to exceed lump sum in order to be able to get the work moving. So we want to be able to do this to make sure that we are keeping momentum. We want everything to always be in writing. We want it to have a clear criteria, and that's going to include expectations and boundaries, which might be a not to exceed lump sum amount, which might identify the specific scope of work that we're speaking to when we're talking about this specific field directive. We're going to want to take a picture of the situation when we take it back to the job site in order to ensure whether or not it is original contract scope or if there are portions of it that need to be clarified and therefore are able to be determined to be additional scope. And we need to put our Hancock on it. We went ahead and gave them the directive to keep the work moving. So we need to take accountability and responsibility for the decisions that are being made. We also need to make sure that we're following it up with a contractual document. Does it require an RFI, a request for information, to provide more clarity about the situation? Or does it need to have a change request or a proposed change order? In both instances, we're going to be able to identify who is going to be taking on the majority of the responsibility of this scope of work. Then we're going to want to log into our field directive tracking log and make sure that we're keeping track of each of these field directives that we're putting out onto the job site. We're not just walking around pointing our fingers, yeah, do this, do that. Field Directive 1, Field Directive 2. No, these need to have credibility behind them. When you're putting authorization to work out in the field, you also are going to be building trust and relationships with the people that you're working with. So if you're not able to stand by a field work directive right now, then in the future, no one's going to take you for your word. So being able to make sure that you're documented with clarity of the expectations and the outcome of this particular field work directive, then you're going to be able to build the trust in your construction team. Then what is the closeout status? How did we resolve that particular field directive? So this is going to help us determine if it was original scope work and a change order, or excuse me, a proposed change request or a change request was rejected. It's going to let us know if there was an RFI that went through that provided clarification of it being in the original scope, or if it did identify additional scope of work that needs to be considered in the overall contract. Then once we've determined this, we can determine if it's a change request, which is a change being requested on the owner, architect, construction management side of the project, or if it is going to be a proposed change request, which is going to be a proposed change from the contractor in the original contract scope of work, and therefore requires them to identify a potential cost and potential time impact of this particular situation. So why are work directives important? I think we've talked about the most important reason, and that is to be able to keep the flow or the momentum of the work moving. It's really hard when contractors have to stop and start, especially if it means that we might lose a subcontractor for a couple, 3 days if they leave our job site. So a field work directive is going to provide flexibility and an immediate response to the issue at hand. This is going to enable your team to quickly address any unexpected issues that may arise and keep that momentum on your project. It's going to reduce downtime, which prevents costly delays by allowing immediate work while maintaining project control. It's also going to support our budget control because it provides documentation of work that may later be reflected in project cost. That's why it's so important that you use your construction experience to be able to identify and assess the situation and determine a lump sum amount not to exceed in that moment, so that you can give yourself enough time to be able to go back and really develop the formal forward projection of this particular issue. But the number one reason why we want to keep field work directives is for project momentum. Many times we have too many hands in the money pot. We have unforeseen conditions that can arise, poor planning that doesn't allow us to be able to really understand what might come up in the progress of work, subcontractors showing up late on a job site or working in each other's space, and then understanding the different types of work and the different scopes of work of everyone involved. These are all reasons of why it might be necessary to use a field work directive in order to be able to keep the momentum of the project moving forward. So how is a field work directive created? Well, we're going to identify initial identification, then we're going to provide formal documentation, and then we need authorization. So the initial understanding of what it is that we're dealing with is what is going to generate that field work directive. It's usually a superintendent coming to your trailer and pulling you out and saying, look, you got to come see this. And so as a construction manager, you would go out to that location with your superintendent, you would talk about it. And in that moment, based on the information that's provided and the evidence that you're able to see, you would determine, is this something that has a potential resolution that just needs a little bit of clarity? Or is this something that really is going to take more engineering? We're going to have a structural consultant come in and be able to design something different. In that case, a field work directive might not be the best mode of being able to document change in the original contract. But if in the moment we've run across an unforeseen condition and there's a gas line in our way, and we're able to hand dig around it in order to be able to keep the project moving and being able to continue with the installation of our own utility trench, then this might be a spot where we want to be able to acknowledge that it's taking the contractor more time than they had anticipated to be able to perform this scope of work because we have something unforeseen that's in the way. We want to take the opportunity to be able to document in our as-built this gas line and whether or not it is something that we need, something that should be abandoned. And so being able to identify a field work directive that keeps work moving in that momentum is going to be very important. Anytime a contractor has to stop and start work, it's going to cost the project time and money. And if that contractor is super busy, they're going to move to another job site and they're going to start a scope of work over there. And it's going to be harder for them to leave that scope of work just to pounce back over once we've decided we've figured out what we want to do on our job site. So keeping in mind and keeping clarity about the different challenges that your subcontractors are going through, trying to identify a field work directive that keeps momentum in the project is going to be very important. Now, when you've identified what it is, then we need to go back and make sure we follow with formal documentation. That formal documentation could be a change request from the owner, asking the contractor to please move forward with a specific direction. It could be a proposed change order from the contractor who recognizes that this is not in their scope of work, but they do have a good idea of how to be able to move forward with it, but it will cost this amount and it potentially may have this time impact. And then understanding that that formal documentation, once being reviewed, assessed by the parties of the team, will require an authorization and an approval in order to be able to ensure that we're all on the same page. And so moving forward with these interactions in this order with a field work directive is going to help build trust. It's going to build credibility with your team so that when something comes up, they have the confidence that you don't always have to have a big, long meeting, a whole bunch of paperwork, and a lot of directives in order to get them to move forward and keep the work going. So it's very important because a field work directive doesn't mean that anybody has to do it. It simply is a tool that is effectively used by making sure that you develop relationships that know that you're going to take accountability and you're building trust with the team that you're working with. So a field work directive may come in many different forms. I showed you already one where you can write directly on the drawings themselves of what's going on in the moment and then identify a lump sum not to exceed with your signature date and the criteria of that scope of work. But we can also have something a little bit more formal that provides a field work directive template. And in that template, there's some key components that we want to make sure that we cover. And that is, again, identifying what number or field work directive this is, who is doing the authorization of this field work directive, who is the work being directed to, what is that anticipated scope of work, what is the proposed resolution that came up at the time that we were able to meet on site, and where is the authorized signatures for 100% buy-in for everyone that is taking care of this situation. Now, again, this field work directive most likely is in response to a small portion of what may become a bigger directive in the future, but that bigger directive would be covered by a change request or a proposed change order to eventually move into an approved change order. So when we're implementing a field work directive, we are going to assign the work. So the contractor receives the field work directive and understands that that work can now proceed immediately. We're going to start tracking costs and time so that we can detail what is really original contract work and what may be seen as additional work and be able to separate those once a deeper assessment of this issue can be reviewed. And then we're going to identify finalized documentation. All work under Field Work Directive is documented and submitted for adjustment in final costs and schedule impact. We do this because we want to make sure that we're not double dipping anywhere and getting paid for what should be original contract work and dividing that from our additional scope. The way we're going to be able to do that is through what is called time and material. So time and material is really just exactly how it sounds. It's funny how sometimes in construction it can be so complex, but yet we have such simple terms. So time and material is tracking the time that was used by equipment and labor in this particular situation where there is a question of whether it's original contract or additional scope of work. Then we are also going to then add in that material so that in the future it can be determined if a portion of that material was also expected to be in the original contract scope, or if it also is additional and therefore needs to be compensated for. What we need to recognize when we're doing time and material is that it's going to include also equipment, and that we usually want there to be someone who is overseeing this process. Sometimes we can assign it to an inspector, and in that moment, it doesn't mean that the inspector has to be there for 24/7 while that work is taking place on the time and material sheets, but there needs to be very close comprehension of the time that's being recorded and the time that's being spent. So for that, we would expect an inspector to be able to do multiple visits during an 8-hour day to ensure that the people that we say are working on this issue, the material and equipment that is being assigned to this issue, are truly all working the full 8 hours on this particular time and material issue. Now, one very important thing that we want to bring up when we're talking about this is being able to manage the monitoring of time and material sheets and field work directive work. So this site monitoring, again, is going to ensure that the directive is being carried out as instructed per the scope of work and within anticipated limits. Ensure time and material documentation is appropriately representing the work taking place. The biggest issue that comes with this is people just continuing to do the work until they think that the work is complete, instead of working to the limits of the monetary ceiling that has been put on this scope of work. So when we're looking at that, we want to ensure that our cost management is being focused on by continuously tracking those costs associated with the Field Work Directive to prevent potential overruns. And this is going to help keep the owner informed and ready for anticipated risk and cost so that they can continually be monitoring their own budget to ensure that they're going to be able to afford the work continuing in progress. Then we're going to have to, at some point, look at the final conversion to approve or not approve the work. Once cost and time are finalized, The Field Work Directive can be submitted as a proposed change order and evaluated for contractual elements. Any determination is going to identify additional work, and that scope then can be considered and documented as a formal change order to move through the approval process. Now, again, ideally, the whole purpose of a Field Work Directive is to work through the issues determining if this is a legitimate change to the scope or not, because we don't want the contractor to finish the work 100% complete before we let the contractor know whether or not we intend to reimburse or pay them for the effort that has been provided. This is why it's so important that we recognize the difference between an approval and what it is meant by verification. So when we have a time and material sheet and we're talking to someone about whether or not we approve this Field Work Directive and the contractor is going to be moving forward, the approval does not mean that we approve of the opinion of the contractor that this is above and beyond the original scope. This simply means that we approve that the contractor may move forward by tracking their time, material, and equipment, and that they're going to do so by identifying those hours through verification of time and material sheets. So when we put our signature on the bottom of a time and material sheet, we also want to be very clear that we are only doing that for verification of the contribution that the contractor says was made to that particular situation. So if there's 8 hours of labor and 8 hours of backhoe and form work that was included as part of the materials, then we're verifying that the contractor did, in fact, invest 8 hours of labor, 8 hours of a backhoe, and the materials for form work. However, it does not mean that we're approving that we also agree with the contractor that that scope of work is outside of the original contract. So this is very important to understand, because there are many people who have signed a time and material sheet who have been trapped into believing that they now are responsible for the cost associated with that work simply because they verified the hours that the contractor was submitting for that particular work. So this can bring disadvantages that we want to be aware of when working with Field Work Directors. Obviously, there can be a runaway scope of work. This happens when the contractor continues to work in the flow of work that was approved when the lump sum not to exceed was identified, but they feel that they know that this is out of the scope, and in order to be able to continue with their other contractual work, they need to finish up this work that's under dispute. And so they continue working without getting updated verification that they're going to be paid or reimbursed for the effort that they've put into this. So we want to be very careful with this type of scope creep, because it's going to result in additional, often unplanned tasks that can overextend resources, delay timelines, and create confusion among project teams. And really, most importantly, what it does is it steals the opportunity from the owner who's paying for the project to be able to determine if they wish to continue moving forward in this direction or if they want to redirect. And so it's very important that the contractor give the owner that option, because they are the ones who are going to be paying for the work, and therefore the owner should have input on how that work is taking place. This can lead to a runaway budget, where Field Work Directives that are issued without well-defined budget constraints can cause costs to spiral unexpectedly. As changes accumulate, costs can quickly exceed initial estimates, and this will strain project finances and potentially result in disputes over that particular compensation. We also need to look at the root cause analysis. When you wait too long to define the root cause of the issue and the full extent of the work can lead to paying for work already in the contract or not addressing the underlying issue to ensure that the Field Work Directive solves the actual problem rather than creating a temporary fix that will then require rework in the future and therefore will be money not well spent that has to be redone. And so incredibly important to not let a field work directive just carry itself out through the life of the issue. With the field work directive, it simply is a tool to allow momentum of the project while we quickly determine what we want the final result to be. When you do this and you don't have expectations and boundaries in place, a field work directive really can lead to misalignment among project teams. Without clear communication on what is included in the directive, teams may begin to interpret and have different perspectives about where the directive needs to go. And this is going to lead to inconsistent work and unmet project requirements. But as we've identified, there are many benefits for effective field work directives, and we just need to make sure that we manage it appropriately by having clear documentation, by having prompt communication. Again, the field work directive is used to keep the flow and the momentum of the project moving, which means all stakeholders are directly involved in the communication so that everyone can be on the same page. We need to have cost accountability and identify very clearly what was expected per the original contract and now what is different that is causing a difference between the original contract scope and now the potential add scope. This is going to keep the project moving, so it's going to keep our schedule fluent. There may be times when we even know that the work that we're doing isn't 100% valuable. So for instance, if we have a weather delay and we're putting rock down in the mud and we are trying to provide stability in a certain situation, but we'll know that we'll never be able to use that base rock again, there's going to be money lost in that situation. But in the overall big picture, it was important in order for us to be able to keep the work moving. Supports on-site problem solving. So when we can do field work directives by trusting our inner core team and by being able to build those relationships that identify that we take accountability and that we have leadership in the moment, then we're able to ensure that budget and project scope remain clear and that we're able to keep the project moving. It also provides flexibility by ensuring compliance with the project's overall goals. So some key takeaways that I hope that you can take from this CM Skill Builder course is identifying that field work directives offer essential flexibility, enabling teams to move forward in the face of unforeseen site conditions. By understanding how to generate, implement, and manage field work directives, construction managers can ensure timely responses and maintain project alignment. Effective field work directives management ensures quality, budget adherence, and efficient progress in every project stage. So recognizing again, a tool only works as good as you, the user. So making sure that you're able to develop those relationships that provide credibility, accountability, and develop trust within your teams. So be very clear with the expectations and directives being produced with your field work directives, and make sure that you have identified the boundaries that not only provide protections to the owner, but provide protections for the entire team, including the contractor. So just reminding you for next steps, if you want to join the CM Skill Builder, it identifies CM tasks that are specific to the industry. And in our mini course development, you'll be able to learn everything that you need to know about construction management. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next video.